December 18th, 2012 City Council meeting to order. Please rise with me for the Pledge of Allegiance. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Thank you. Please call the roll.
Councilmember Francisco.
Here.
Hotchkiss. House. Murillo.
Here.
Rouse. White. Mayor Schneider.
Here. Okay. Are there any changes to the agenda? Okay. We're going to move on to public comment. And I know Superintendent of Schools David Cash and Board President Monique Limon wanted to be here, and they went from Goleta and they're on their way. So hopefully, if they don't get here by the end of public comment, we may want to allow them to speak when they do get here. So we're going to have 2 minutes here at the podium, and we'll start with Bill Wagner, to be followed by Nancy Tunnell. Good
Good
afternoon.
afternoon, Madam Mayor, council members. I'm old school. Merry Christmas, Happy New Year. Hey, the reason I come before you is, as a senior citizen just recently, I've been informed that Cox Cable has a discount for those of us who are eligible to apply for. The problem is it seems to be a deep, dark secret that nobody knows about. I live in a senior housing complex up at State and La Cumbre, up in that area. There's 84 units. And the way I found out about it was another senior citizen, older than I'm the baby there, but she's all excited because she's now going to be able to get Cox Cable because she found out about the discount procedure. And I said, what are you talking about? And she explained it to me, how you come down to City Hall, get the form and all that, which is good, but it's a secret. Nobody knows about it. I went down to Loretto Plaza, Cox Cable, and said, do you guys, is this a secret you want to tell us about or whatever? They don't want to talk about it, called corporate, and the gentleman I spoke to said he'd been with them for 18 years, and over the years this has come up, and when he's brought it up to people he's been trying to give service to, he gets yelled at by management at Cox Cable. They don't want anybody to know about it. I'm thinking because the city of Santa Barbara and Cox Cable have a good working relationship, maybe a letter to Cox Cable say, hey, let the senior citizens of this town know what you have to offer them. Don't keep it a secret. Am I asking too much? I don't know. I tried to contact your office yesterday, and the lady...
I got the message. I did.
That lady who answers your phones, double her salary. She is good. You're a hard lady to get a hold of. But, do I even have an issue here? That's what I wanted to find out before I came up here publicly and embarrassed myself. But is it an issue? Is it a concern that us senior citizens have a discount that nobody tells us that we're eligible for?
We can certainly bring the message over to Cox Communication. It's their programming, but I thank you for alerting us to it.
Okay.
Thank you. Nancy Tunnell will be followed by Dr. Robert Johns.
I was at a gathering a while back, asked a prominent member of the Progressive Democrats if she was familiar with Agenda 21. She goes, oh, you people on the loony left, you just make this stuff up. So I turned to David Krieger. Do you know about Agenda 21? I get a deer-in-the-headlights stare and total silence. Then I asked, does anybody know anything about Agenda 21? Come on. Finally, David Krieger goes, well, I think it came out of the Rio Earth Summit. I go, oh, yeah. Frustrated with the fact that people we count on to be knowledgeable about politics and policies could be so oblivious. After all, anyone with a computer can research this stuff. Later, I continue my research of NGOs and organizations pushing Agenda 21, and I ran across the World Future Council. Not surprisingly, headed by a handful of men from the Club of Rome, internationalists working toward globalization and the restructuring of our lives through Agenda 21. They had padded their ranks with influential activists at the local level, and lo and behold, who was there? David Krieger. So I give him a call, and I leave a message. Saw you on the World Future Council website, wondered why you seem so uninformed about Agenda 21. He calls me back and now has no hesitation about his knowledge of Agenda 21. When I ask about his understanding of the Wildlands Project, which is a part of Agenda 21, he asks, well, is that with one word or two? So who knows what he actually knows? But how can any of you, seemingly responsible people, be so unconcerned about an agenda intended to change everything we do in life, especially one meant to be implemented through stealth? Obviously, the success of Agenda 21 is dependent upon naive people who want to believe they're doing good, and as such are unconcerned with who actually put this agenda together, who profits from it, and what the end result will be for your grandchildren. Thank you.
Robert Johns will be followed by Rostamam.
I am Dr. Robert L. Johns, PhD, clinical psychologist. This is the fifth in a series of comments that I intend to make concerning the program for at-risk youth. I'd just like to say that the public school system, and this is any public school system in the country, are agenda-driven. In other words, they are driven to develop the curriculum for the children, for the youth. And this agenda-driven item on their task force gets children into a lot of problems. Teachers are not aware of and do not know how to take care of emotionally disturbed kids with personality issues. And this is one of the major problems that we're suffering right now from the school districts, not just here, but all over the country. The program for at-risk youth is an innovative program, and what they will do is they will take these children who have been set aside. I'm trying to use the language that I can possibly, have been set aside by the school district. They've been set aside by the school district. They do not know how to handle these kids. Our program will give those kids that high school degree, and they will also put them in junior college, community college, or four-year college. This is innovation. And if school district is to survive, it's going to have to begin to innovate itself. That's obvious. Thank you, board members.
Rostamam will be followed by Kenneth Locke.
Good afternoon, Madam Mayor and council people. Of course, I was devastated by the events this weekend, and I always try to come up with solutions, but it just seems like when you hear the history of that young boy, and he hadn't seen his father or his mother, he's been living with his mother, hadn't seen his father or his older brother for years, you just wonder in the community why there wasn't, like, you know, big brothers or somebody he could connect with. And just, it's so hard because I feel like there should be something done, like even here, maybe like police inside the, take all the property of guns that are just there, because sometimes they get in the wrong hands. Take all the guns that, you know, gangs or criminals have if they can, and donate it like they did in New York, and make statues of all the children that died, you know, to or it's sad that maybe just police should have guns, and firemen or whatever, and maybe if you want to go shooting or go hunting or go shooting, you can rent them at the facilities. That'd be a perfect world, but everybody wants gun rights. And let me see. And it's good seeing everybody. I've been working on getting housing, and I got an apartment now, and I'm very happy. And I just want to pray about this situation, and yeah, here, I don't know, you know, seems like there'd be good programs, and there could be more done for at-risk youth, like that Garden Nut Gangs that I wanted to do out at the county where Oscar Carmona did it, before, so maybe I can focus on that now and trying to go back to City College. And happy Hanukkah, well, late Hanukkah, and Merry Christmas to everybody.
Thank
and
you.
Have a happy, healthy New Year.
Kenneth Locke will be followed by Dr. David Cash, and the final speaker will be Monique Lamone.
My name is Kenneth Locke. Got some signs. I haven't been doing it for a little bit, but now just yesterday maybe or so I restarted making some signs. And I came back with the idea that just capitalism, I think we need to recognize it. And I just did a sign that says capitalism is stupid. And along with my classic, which is idiots suck. And they kind of work together. And then this morning, I actually was going to do the sign back a little ways ago. It says, got retarded. And it's a little misspelled. I'm emphasizing the ART. And it turns out that art and art education, I'm claiming to actually have mastered art and can bring it over to the understanding of where it's understood as a spiritual practice and how we become all spiritual beings. But it just turns out that historically, the artists have suffered from mental illness and then also physical illness. And the way it's a gauge to use, maybe I could share with you today, a gauge to use for this next stage in relation to recognizing yourself right now, in relation to your development, would be in relation to the term interdisciplinary. I mentioned that before to you guys, interdisciplinary. So take two disciplines that you have developed a relationship with, and then how far are you developed? And then that would be the lump sum of your development. And most likely, when it comes to art, there's probably not really anybody really developed in art, the arts or athletics. So we're in a bad situation now, which I can actually provide this community with the means for benefiting. Thank you.
Dr. David Cash.
Good afternoon, Madam Mayor, members of the council. I'm here on behalf of the Santa Barbara Unified School District to give you a brief report on school safety. Much has been and will be written about the latest incidents of senseless violence on a school campus, but I believe there will never be a rational explanation for what has happened or anything that will ever be written that could reasonably justify the senseless taking of lives of those children. I want you to know that schools in the Santa Barbara Unified School District take very seriously our responsibility for developing school safety plans that protect the safety of students and staff during times of crisis or disaster. I would argue that our school campuses are generally the safest places in our communities for children to be. But I want you to understand that those plans are not designed to, nor should we ever expect them to protect our schools against senseless, horrific acts of violence. I believe the key to safer schools is a very long-term proposition, and it's going to require a commitment that goes far beyond the fences of our school sites in Santa Barbara. It's going to require that us as a community, as a state and a nation, teach and model the principles of peace building and diplomacy in our schools and in our communities. I want you to know that we have undertaken steps in our own schools to increase security. We have communicated with all staff to review our protocols, procedures, and actions that we will take in the case of an emergency. We will begin to deploy new technologies to increase communication in case of an emergency. And I can't tell you how thankful I am to be working with Jim Armstrong. I want to thank him publicly for his work on our strategic plan, and Cam Sanchez, our great law enforcement partner. They're great examples. Our new SRO at Santa Barbara High School and Santa Barbara Junior High School provides a very positive presence for students in our community. You know, as the superintendent, I hope that the lesson that we learn in the recent series of senseless killings is one that we need to elevate everyone in our society. No one can be left behind. In our schools, this means that everyone gets whatever they need in order to be successful and productive citizens in our community. I believe we are all Americans, and that this is an American problem, and therefore it should also be our own personal problem that we need to take responsibility for. How we treat our next door neighbor or a homeless person on the street, how we schedule our classes in our school, how we staff our schools. All of this is noticed by our children, and that will find its way into the norms they establish for themselves as they become adults. This is not going to be easy, but it will be necessary. I'll conclude by saying during the holiday season, those of us that are fortunate enough to be with friends and family, I believe we have an opportunity to strengthen our nation by modeling the principles of peace, diplomacy, and basic human kindness. We have an opportunity to influence children each and every day. We must do so in a proactive and positive way. I can only wonder, in the case of the recent violence against those innocent children in Connecticut, how many opportunities were lost because someone didn't think it was important to care or to act like they cared. Again, this is not an issue just for our schools. I believe it's an issue that must be addressed by every member of our community. We must do whatever it takes to ensure that every child gets every chance every day to be whatever they want to be. And as the superintendent of the Santa Barbara Unified School District, I want you to know that I am committed to doing so. I'm committed to leading our district to make whatever changes are necessary to ensure that no student is anonymous in who they are and what they need from us as the adults in the community. Thank you.
Thank you. And I know it's a very busy time of year for you to take the time to come here. And I believe you were just up in the city of Goleta and rushed over here to be here on time. So thank you.
Absolutely. Wouldn't miss it.
Thank you very much. Monique Lamone.
Good afternoon, Madam Mayor and honorable council members. On December 14th, our country was devastated and impacted by the tragedy that occurred at Sandy Hook Elementary School. The loss of lives of 20 children and adults has devastated our nation. As president of the Santa Barbara Unified School District Board of Education, my heart goes out to the victims, their families, and the community at large who suffered this tragedy. I recently read a post from a local mother who has a 5th grader in our community, who upon walking into the classroom on Monday learned about the tragedy that had occurred. The child, who is 10, called this the 9/11 of his time. I know that what happened in Newtown is something that we hope will never, ever happen anywhere, but it will forever change how we think about school safety. As elected officials, the public has placed their trust in us to serve and protect our community. On that day, we had heroes. The teachers and the school administrators put their lives on the line to do the same, to protect their students. I know that in our community, in our schools, our teachers would have done the same. Our district stands in solidarity with Newtown and will send our thoughts, good wishes to the community. We are joining with the Connecticut State PTA and encouraging any students and members of the community who want to help the new and temporary school by sending, as my 5-year-old niece has done, snowflakes with messages to adorn their temporary school. We also, at the district, are sending our thoughts and good wishes via a card and notebook that will be sent to the community in Newtown. We have a community member in Montecito who's originally from Newtown, who went to school at Sandy Hook Elementary School, that is offering to take any good wishes, thoughts, or any mementos of any sorts to the community. So we're here to, as collaborators, as in the effort to think about school safety and community safety. Thank you.
Thank you, and thank you for being here. Our thoughts and prayers are with everyone at Newtown, and know that we at the city want to partner with the school district in any which way we can when it comes to school safety. So thank you for being here very much. That's it for public comment, so we move on to our consent calendar.
Item number 1, adoption of ordinance of the Council of the City of Santa Barbara adopting the 2012-2013 Memorandum of Understanding between the City of Santa Barbara and the Santa Barbara Police Management Association. Recommendation that council adopt by reading of title only an ordinance of the Council of the City of Santa Barbara adopting the 2012-2013 Memorandum of Understanding between the City of Santa Barbara and the Santa Barbara Police Management Association. Item number 2, adoption of erosion and sedimentation control ordinance. Recommendation that council adopt by reading of title only an ordinance of the Council of the City of Santa Barbara adding Chapter 22.85 to the Santa Barbara Municipal Code relating to erosion and sedimentation control standards for construction.
Thank you. Without further objection, we'll waive further reading. I just wanted to bring up item 7 briefly. Any other items on the consent calendar? Okay, could you just read item number 7?
Memorandum of Understanding with Santa Barbara County and concerned citizens for safe passage.
Thank you. I don't need to vote on this separately. I just wanted to bring this up. This was something that came to the council several months ago, and I know it went to the county as well. This is the area around the Mission and the Women's Club and the Natural History Museum and the park and the Rose Garden, about how to find ways to safe passage. I mean, it's the way to talk about it. And in terms of pedestrians and bicyclists and people in cars, and looking, and it's the county and the church and the mission and the city. It's very complicated. So I just want to appreciate that this has moved forward, and having an MOU between the group and the county and the city, I think, is a great step forward. So I just want to say good job. That was it for me. Any other, Mr. Hotchkiss?
Just a quick comment on that last that item. In the past, it was questionable whether I lived closer than I should to this, but I'm slightly outside the 1,000 foot marker, and I think that my constituents would be disappointed if, knowing this area well, I didn't weigh in on it. So I'm going to participate.
So you technically can and you will.
Technically can and I will, although Mr. Wiley's probably over there grimacing, but that's just.
No, if you're outside the 1,000-foot mark, you should be fine. Okay. Anything else, or is there a motion for the consent calendar?
Move approval of the consent agenda.
I had a comment, Madam Mayor,
Sure.
on item 7.
Item 7, go ahead, Ms. Murillo.
Thank you. It seems like this issue has been revisited several times in history, and perhaps this is the attempt that gets us somewhere. And I would encourage Mr. Dayton, since you're assigned to it, or the county folks who are working on it, to keep a file that can be referenced in the future, because I wonder, it does seem we've reinvented the wheel a little bit, and the document that's been released so far, so thorough, and everyone's making such a good effort. Please have it documented and an electronic version available for future reference. Thank you.
Thank you. I heard there was a motion. Was there a second? Mr. White, did you have a comment?
No, I just
okay.
was moving.
I'll second.
Move approval.
Thank you. Moved and seconded. All in favor?
Aye.
Great. Okay, move on to item number 12. Oh, sorry, report from the Finance Committee. Mr. Francisco.
Madam Mayor, today the Finance Committee met and heard a report that you will find eerily similar soon.
Deja vu all over again, which would be item number 12.
Comprehensive Annual Financial Report, CAFR, for the fiscal year ended June 30, 2012.
Thank you. Mr. Samario.
Thank you, Madam Mayor, members of council. Bob Samario, Finance Director, here to present to you today the comprehensive annual financial report that we affectionately refer to as the CAFR, and it is for the fiscal year ended June 30, 2012, which is about 6 months ago or 5 months ago. I wanted to point out that we have with us today the partner from the CPA firm that audited the city's financial statements, Lansell Longhard. His name is Mr. Richard Kikuchi. He was part of the presentation to the Finance Committee just about an hour ago. He's here to answer questions if necessary, but I will cover sort of the results of the audit on his behalf. So I'm going to just I'm going to go more quickly and cover less material than we did at the Finance Committee. I know Mr. Francisco appreciates that, but I will cover a little bit of background information, a little bit how to read the document, and I think you all should have one in front of you so you can see what it looks like and just how that's organized. A few financial highlights, and then I will talk about the audit requirements and results. So typically we talk about this at the end, but I wanted initially to start off with some acknowledgments. There are two people here who worked extremely hard in putting this document together over the last 4 months. They are Doug Smith and Lynn Sparks, if you can stand up. It was an extraordinary year for them for a number of reasons. The whole impact of the RDA going away and the impact on our accounting and financial reporting. But also we had our accounting manager leave right in the middle of the audit in August. So a lot of that weight that she carried really fell to Lynn and Doug. So I just wanted to personally and publicly announce, or at least say that I really appreciate how much they worked this year. Way too many hours, and hopefully next year it'll be back to normal. Now they have to go to another meeting. The FMS replacement project. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Absolutely.
Thank you.
So starting with some basics. What is a CAFR? This is something that we only do once a year, fortunately. It's an annual financial report that every city, county, special district, state, and national, even federal government has to issue. Publicly held companies in the private sector have to issue an annual financial report that has to be audited by an independent CPA. And what it does, it's supposed to present the financial condition of the entity, in our case the city, and how that's changed over the last year. For us, it's an important document because, as you know, we look kind of forward with a budget, but at the end of the year, how do we really end the year? Are we in good financial condition, and has that financial condition improved over the last year, or did it get worse? And we call it a comprehensive annual financial report because we submit it to the GFOA, which is the Government Finance Officers Association, for an award, a fairly prestigious award in financial reporting. And so we add certain elements to the document, particularly what you would see in the back section, the statistical section, not required, but we put it there anyway because we want to get the award. But also, more importantly, we think it provides good information to the readers, particularly our community. And why is it prepared? One, we're required to, under city charter, to prepare an annual financial report and have that be audited by an independent CPA, also required by state law. Bonding companies require that we issue a CAFR, and they use that extensively whenever we sell bonds in order to determine what kind of a credit risk we might be and what kind of interest rate we might pay on long-term debt. And even on an ongoing basis, they make sure that the bonds that we have outstanding that should be adjusting our credit rating. So they look at the CAFR a lot. And we just think it's important, and we prepared because it does communicate important information about the city, financial results of operations, and the like. So 3 major sections to the document. We call it the introductory section, which includes a letter of transmittal to you, the city council members, as well as a list of city officials, an organization chart, and things like that. But the real body of the document is what we call the financial section. This is the part that is really what the auditors look like. It's all the numbers and all that. It includes a 2-page document, which is their report. It's at the very beginning called the Independent Auditor's Report, and I'll talk about that a little bit later. There's a document or a section in there called the Management's Discussion and Analysis. I think of it as sort of the budget message in the budget document. If it's one thing you want to look at, because there's so much information here, you'd want to read that. It's about 10 pages long, but really a good summary of everything that occurred this past year. And then the body of the report is the basic financial statements, and then that's where all the numbers are, and then footnotes that describe those numbers in more detail. And then the part that I mentioned before, the statistical section, not required, but we put it there anyway. Good information. You ever get a chance to look at some 10-year trend information on revenues, expenditures, some demographic data, and the like. So I'm going to really focus on just the one section, which is, of course, the core of this document, the basic financial statements. And if you'd like to, if you're interested in following along, you can turn to page 24 of the document. This is it's only 2 pages in length. They're opposing pages, 24 and 25. These are referred to as the government-wide statements, and it's relatively new statements that were required starting in 2001. And the idea is that when you look at individual funds, it's great. You can sort of assess the financial condition of an individual fund like the general fund, but overall, for the city as a whole, how do we know whether we are in good financial condition or not and whether the trend is good or not? And the government-wide statements consolidate all the city's operations into 2 columns, as you'll see on page 24, the governmental activities and the business type activities column. So everything that we do citywide in 2 columns. The theory is that it's more helpful for a reader to be able to assess for the city as a whole, what kind of financial condition are we in? I have sort of other thoughts about the value of this because when you're consolidating such disparate operations like a water fund and a downtown parking operation into one column, you sort of lose how each one is doing. But that's the intent, that's the idea. So that's what the government-wide statements are. And then behind all that are what we're used to. They're called the individual fund financial statements. So that's where you'll see, for example, the general fund and those individual funds that are significant. So some financial highlights. Obviously a big change this year that sort of rippled through the financial statements was the elimination or the dissolution of the redevelopment agency on January 31st. That created a lot of headaches for us from an accounting perspective and for financial reporting purposes. So you're going to see some big numbers in some of these statements if you're looking at the details of money's moving out and in. What's happened is that you might recall in 2011, in June of 2011, in anticipation of state law that would eliminate redevelopment agencies, the city took action. The city council took action to transfer all assets of the former RDA to the city, and that the idea was that we want to protect those assets. With the new law that came into place, AB 1484, or in AB 1X26, we had to undo that. We had to sort of say, no, you can't do that. So we effectively had to reverse all those transactions and then do it appropriately when the RDA actually went away on January 31st. So you're going to see a reversal of what we did in June of 11, but then sort of the same entries occurred, but only as of January 31st when the RDA was dissolved. So all that means that you're going to see some big numbers, and I will see some of those going in and out of these documents. So this is the government-wide statements, page 24. This is a statement of net assets. Ostensibly, this is supposed to tell you what kind of financial condition the city as a whole is in. And as I mentioned, it's 2 columns of data, the governmental activities column and the business type activities column. Easier to start with the second one because that's what you're familiar with. That's all the enterprise funds: water, wastewater, downtown parking, airport, waterfront, solid waste, and the Gulf Fund. All of those operations are consolidated into one column. Again, the theory is you can sort of assess on the whole how we're doing. And then to the left of that is everything else. That's what we call governmental activities. Primarily, that's the general fund. That's the largest component of that. But it includes funds like the Creeks Fund, our Measure A fund, those restricted funds that we call or classify into the special revenue category. So that's all consolidated into one column. One of the things that I pointed out to the Finance Committee I think is important and unique to this presentation, unlike when we've seen in the past, is that it does report all of the capital assets between the governmental activities and the business type activities. We've always known that enterprise funds are capital intensive, but in reality, when you look at everything else, all the other assets that the governmental side has are pretty significant as well. As of June 30, 2012, we had $306 million of assets, things such as land, building, parks, sidewalks, streets, and the like, all of that with a cost of $306 million net of depreciation. So you can see it's pretty close to what all the enterprise have in terms of total assets. And then it also includes long-term debt. On the business side, it's really all the bonds that are outstanding in loans with the state for water and wastewater. And in the bottom, again, is a measure of the financial condition. Always good when you see positive numbers there because that means we have a positive, equity position or financial position. Most of the net asset number you can see is the first row called invested in capital assets. So of all the assets we have, most of that is in the form of a capital asset, but there are some portions that are restricted and unrestricted that are more liquid. And within the government activities, for example, that's where we have all our reserves for contingencies and for disasters. So this is what we call the balance sheet of the general fund, and this is in a format you're more familiar with. We don't see all the capital assets in here, nor do we see any long-term liabilities. And so the bottom here, the fund balances, the net number of $27 million. It's not intended to tell you what kind of financial condition the general fund is because it doesn't. Only when you include long-term assets and long-term liabilities can you really make that assessment. But what this tells you is really how much do we have to spend? What of our resources are spend in a spendable format? And obviously, when you look at the assets that make up that net number, it's cash, it's receivables, things that are more short-term in nature that are available to spend and appropriate. It's kind of a budgetary perspective that this is based on. So down below, we have $27 million in fund balance, and we've always talked about reserves as sort of the same terminology, except when we talk to you about reserves, we really don't talk about the fact that some of those monies aren't available to spend, and they're therefore categorized as non-spendable. For example, we have long-term loans with our employees. That's the MLAP program, Employee Mortgage Loan Assistance Program. It's an asset of the general fund. We're eventually going to repay that, but we know that that's not spendable today. Over time, as these loans are repaid, it'll become spendable. So we set it aside as part of this non-spendable portion. Within that, we also include other receivables that have been made to the Gulf Fund and the Waterfront Fund. Those are long-term receivables. Those aren't just available to spend today. So we set those aside. And really the portion that's the significant here is what's called committed. $18 million, that's our reserve for disasters, reserve for contingencies and the like. And that's the $18 million.
If I could, Mr. Samario, that's supposed to be by 25 million, correct? The 18?
Yes, and it's actually, and I mentioned this in the Finance Committee, since a portion of our fund balance is tied up in some of these long-term receivables, particularly Waterfront Fund, we have 2 outstanding receivables with them. We also have a loan to the Gulf Fund. When we talk to you about what reserve balances that are available, we actually consider some of those available because, like with the Waterfront, for example, they could repay those tomorrow if they had to. They have sufficient reserve, their own reserves, and if they had to, if we say we had an emergency, we need those monies, they would repay those to us. So when we talk to you about reserve balances, we include those as being available. So I always sort of think we're in the $20 to $21 million range of what we actually have.
All right, that's what I want to know. Thank you.
This is the results of the general fund in a summarized version. If you wanted to look at the detail, you can see it on page 83, where you can see a comparison of budget to actual revenues and expenditures. Just wanted to show you a summary. We've talked a lot about this when we come to you on a quarterly basis, what our revenues have done. For example, bed taxes and sales taxes have done really well this past year. Although you wouldn't think that when you look at this comparison between the budget and the actual, that we were actually under budget. In reality, we did really well on the tax category. We didn't do so well on the departmental side, but and this always comes back to kind of bite us in terms of having to explain this. But within this number is that revenue that we budget called anticipated year-end variance, and it's about $1.2 million, and it's supposed to be a measure of what we expect to see of savings on the expenditure side of things. So we never see that revenue being realized. We actually see that as in this category here as an expenditure saving. Overall, taxes did really well, but where we really did well was on the expenditure side. Pretty unusual for us to see a $2.8 million variance, favorable variance at the end of the year. We're typically in the 1.5 to 1.8 region. Just meant that we did a good job of keeping our costs under control. And so we ended up at the end of the year overall on a net basis with a $2.5 million favorable variance in terms of our budget. I wanted to point out that yesterday, you might have read the article in the paper, the news press.
I was going to ask about that.
That said that we overspent $2.8 million.
Yeah.
And they looked at that schedule on page 83 to look at that. It's a positive number. Not sure why they thought it was a sort of a negative thing. They wrote the article on a Sunday, couldn't contact us. I've spoken to the reporter. She apologized, and apparently they made a correction today in the paper. But we actually ended up, again, better than we thought, not the opposite.
Yeah, Madam Mayor and Mrs. Samario, thank you for mentioning. I was about to ask that question because when I read the article, it was just so surprising. When I looked at the CAFR, the only place I could find that they could have pulled it out would have been here. So, and the number went the other way.
Yes.
So for the public, it's
Right.
really important that they know. Thank you.
And she now has my cell number. But, so this is a comparison of what we planned versus the budget and also, what actually transpired. To me, this is the important column here. This tells us, okay, when the dust is settled now, we ended the year with about $930,000 better so revenues over expenditures by about $930,000. In reality, we ended the year, and this is a correction of what I said at the Finance Committee earlier today. We ended the year $1.8 million over revenues over expenditures, but remember the policy now we have for reserves says that we are going to transfer half of the surplus into a capital fund, and we did do that at the end of the year. So that reflects that transfer of an equal amount, $930,000 into our capital fund for programming in the future for infrastructure and capital and the like.
Was that your question, Ms. Murillo? Okay, great.
So reality, we did $1.8 million. We added to reserves. Half is going to capital. The other half, the $930, is going to add to our policy reserves. So we always like to talk about our retirement plan, and this is a footnote disclosure on page 61 through 63. This table is on 63. A lot of information, but I'm going to go through it, carefully. First, we were dealing with fiscal year 2012, and that's important because while we're reporting in on information for this fiscal year, It's based on data we get from PERS 3 years prior. So it's based on an actuarial evaluation completed by PERS as of June 30, 2009. We do have the more recent information. We do have the valuation data for June 30, 11, but for disclosure purposes, we have to report the valuation that relates to the fiscal year 2012, which is 2009. So the way this reads is you'll see that there are 3 different plans that we present: miscellaneous plan, the safety fire plan, and the safety police plan. And that first row or column of numbers is the accrued liability. This is what I always say, that this is money we're supposed to have in the bank if we're appropriately funding this plan along the way. So, for example, in the miscellaneous plan, we should have $363 million in the bank. And to the right of that is what we actually have. And I'm going to qualify that in a moment, but this is presumably what we actually have in the bank, $281 million, at least for this miscellaneous plan. And then to the right is just the difference between those two. Liability versus the actual assets available to pay that liability. We have an unfunded liability of $81.5 million. And based on that, we have a funded status of 77.6. And you may recall that over the last few months or even a year when we talked about how are we doing, we've been talking about numbers closer to 61%, a lot less than this. The reason for that is because in this column, what PERS has us disclose, at least for in the CAPR, is what's called the actuarial value of assets, which is really an inflated number. They do that so that for smoothing purposes, they spread out the asset gains and losses over a 15-year period so that we're not hit in any one year with big losses like we saw recently. So they value the assets sort of higher than what they really are and for that rate-setting purpose. But the reality is, on this next chart in blue, is the true market value of the assets. That's really what we have in the bank to pay those liabilities. So it presents a much different situation. You can see the funded status goes from high 70s and 80 to the 50s. This was probably the lowest point of our funded status. In 2009, that was when we really had the first full year of the big hit of the economic downturn. Since then, we've seen this get better. We've reported 61% recently. That was based on a 2010 valuation. And for 11, it's gotten a little bit better. 12, it dropped down a little bit because of the returns were low. But this is the difference between if somebody looks at our document, our CAPR, and says, wow, we're actually not too bad. But the reality is this is truly where we're at. We're just not disclosing this detail. Questions on that?
Yes, a real quick question. I'm trying to get a reference point to where before 2008, 2009, and it seems to me that in 2006 and 7, in that time frame, we were hovering around 75% at the valuation that might be in the blue chart here, because I changed that. Smoothing happened afterwards, right?
Yeah, that's correct, Mr. House. We were probably in the 70s, maybe even 80s. Mm-hmm. We were overfunded in the early, about 2000, as you know, but we were in the 80s, which isn't too bad. You know, ideally you want to be 100% funded, but yeah, it's dropped down because it dropped down considerably just after a 2-year period, 2008, 2009, where you saw the biggest losses that, at PERS, you know, their investments. I think it was a 25% loss of all their assets. So,
well, and the question I have for you on this is, they give us the information 3 years in arrears, basically, or 3 years, going 3 years back, and that's how they're organized. Do we know where we stand in real time now?
We do. Okay. And that's what I was sort of referring to. We have, the most recent report we have is as of June 30, 2011. And based on that, we are closer to the high 60s. In 2012, we just from what we hear from PERS that they had a rate of return of just 1%. You know, they assume 7.5 now. So that 1% loss or gain is below their assumption. So for 2012, we'll likely see that go back down a little bit more. So they've had 2 pretty good years in 11 and 10 and 11, and in 2012 they had not a bad year, but not a good year.
But those results are not results that are in our hands, just from a layperson's perspective. Those are results that are based on the market value of what the investments and that they're making, right?
Right, that's correct.
Okay, it's their report card.
Right.
Okay, thank you.
And is it 1%?
So for the fiscal year that ended June 30, 2012, PERS earned 1% on all their assets. Actually, I think they refined it to just almost zero, flat. And again, they have to get 7.5% to stay even.
Are their hands locked insofar as what they can invest in to get such a low rate?
Well, that's, Madam Mayor, Councilmember Hotchkiss, no, they're not locked. But if they have a target of 7.5%, they have to invest in things that, for example, we can't legally invest in. They invest in the stock market, they invest in real estate. A large part of their portfolio is in equities, the stock market, because we rely on them earning 7.5%. Now, if PERS decided, you know what, we're going to start investing in much more conservative vehicles, and that will only generate us 3% of return, our rates that we pay will go up substantially, dramatically, in fact, because it's going to come from us or investment returns. So we sort of have to pick our poison in a sense. Historically, they've been earning about 7.5%. We just had a really bad decade. 2001 and 2002 was bad, and then of course recently it was really bad.
1% isn't even keeping up with inflation.
It's not. But it's volatile. We see that every year. It's always up and down. It can vary 10, 15% in any given year. The year before that, it was a 20% return. So you just don't know. It's 7.5 is supposed to be a 20-year average, 20 to 30-year average. So one other benefit that we like to talk about, because it's not talked about a lot, is what we call our other post-employment benefits. This is things that we provide to our retirees other than pensions that also represent a liability to us. One is what we call a retiree medical payment that we make to retirees. When somebody's been with the city 15 years at least, they earn about $300 up to $300 per month toward their medical costs, insurance premiums, and the like. And they get that up to the age of 65. Fortunately, it's capped, and fortunately, it only goes to age 65. Some cities have lifetime medical, full cost, for our retirees, and their liability that they have is enormous. For us, that retiree medical payment, as well as the fact that we allow our retirees to participate in our group insurance plan, and therefore they get a discounted rate because they're sort of meshed with everybody else in the city. And that discount is considered a benefit according to our GASB rules, or accounting rules. And we have to measure that, and we have to actually fund that theoretically. As of July 1, that liability for those two items was $34 million, pretty big number. Of that, the largest piece was the implied subsidy, the discount we provide to retirees' insurance premiums. The smaller portion is a retire medical payment. And then we also have sick leave. People retire and they have accumulated hours. We have to pay that out. And so that's a liability on the books of $4.9 million. So real quickly, I just wanted to mention that, we have Mr. Kikuchi here from the audit firm. He spoke at the Finance Committee. They come out and they do two things. They have to basically test all of our numbers and evaluate our internal controls, because they have to express an opinion on whether these financial statements you see in front of you are presented materially correct in terms of the financial position and results of operations. And their opinion, as I think it's toward the front, 2 pages, indicates that we've gotten a clean opinion. They didn't find anything that would cause them to feel concerned or have a problem with. And they also indicated that they didn't find any material weaknesses in our internal controls. So an unqualified or a clean opinion. We also had no disagreements with management, or they had no disagreements with us. They found no material weaknesses or significant deficiencies in our internal controls, no indications of fraudulent or inappropriate activities, and no findings or questions cost. Real quickly on this last item, we talked about the pensions and the liabilities we have, significant unfunded liabilities. Starting fiscal year 2015, so 3 years from today in terms of the CAFR you'll be seeing, that unfunded liability we have with PERS is going to have to be not just disclosed in a footnote like today, but reported on those government-wide statements. So you're going to see this big fat liability there on the face of our balance sheets that are going to dramatically change from the reader's perspective, our financial position, because now we have this huge liability that we have to sort of stick in there, and our net asset position, which is a measure of our financial condition, is going to potentially go into the negative. This is something that everybody across the country is going to have to do, and it's not really changing, in a sense, the fact what our liability is. It's just putting it more in people's face that here, to the reader, you're no longer going to be able to bury it. This is a big number, so that presumably people are going to deal with it more responsibly or take it more seriously. It's just more of a symbolic move than anything else, but it's a big change, and it's going to have a big impact on a lot of agencies who have significant unfunded liabilities. And over time, presumably as we start to dig into that unfunded liability with higher rates or more contributions from employees, better market results, that number will diminish, but it's something that we're going to have to put on our financial statements starting in 2015. So with that, I'd be happy to answer any questions.
Sure. I don't see any speaker slips on this. Mr. Rouse?
Thank you, Madam Mayor. Mr. Samari, you talked about the new GASB formatting for stating those liabilities, but is that, I mean, that's just a format thing. It's not going to affect our bond rating of those availability issue debt as far as.
Madam Mayor, Councilmember Rouse, I don't think so, because, when we talk about, I just had a conversation a few days ago with Moody's, they already know about these liabilities. I mean, they're well aware of, they are sharp readers of a CAFR, so they know where to look, and they are well aware of the fact that we, as well as other agencies, have these unfunded liabilities that we're going to have to address. So it's really just, again, from my perspective, it's a symbolic change to put it more prominently on the CAFR.
And then going back to the statement of net assets, we talked about our capital assets, and I think you mentioned it, but as we talked about the transference from the RDA back to the successor agency and back again, is this reflective of status quo, or is it prior to that transfer, or what is that?
This reflects within the body of those statements, and you'll see it on page 24 and 25 more prominently, but it reflects the fact that we had to transfer all of the assets of the former RDA to the successor agency, which is accounted for as a separate trust fund. So you're going to see a transfer in the order of $92 million coming from the city of operations into this other operation, the successor agency. It doesn't reflect financial condition at all. It just means that we have to now account for those assets, parking structures, and all those other assets that the RDA owned, and reflect those separately in a private purpose trust fund related to the successor agency. So that's all reflected in those numbers.
But in the worst case scenario, something doesn't go well with Sacramento, do we have to mid-year CAFR to adjust for that, or how does that?
No, it'll just be reflected in the next year's CAFR.
Right, thank you.
Sure.
Mr. Hotchkiss?
Thank you, Madam Mayor. How do we stand our bond rating? Is it changed? Are we good shape? Are we bad shape? What's the deal?
Yeah, it depends, but our bond rating has always been very good. We really don't have any outstanding bonds other than the small $1.8 million bond that's left in the general fund. But we have bonds outstanding in the water and wastewater funds, and as well as the airport and waste and waterfront funds. Our ratings have always been really good. So no, that has not changed recently.
And what are we, A, B? What do you know?
I don't know to be exact.
Mr. House?
Mr. Samaro, we are pretty aware, I think, that of the infrastructure that we own and are responsible for, that we have deferred maintenance and maintenance obligations, I guess is just the best way to say it. And is that reflected here at all, or is that something that's in our future budgets and is projected forward but wouldn't show up in a report like this?
Madam Mayor, Councilmember House, so we're going to get a little technical here, so I apologize. It is in effect measured now on this CAFR. One of the criticisms of the previous accounting CAFR, or CAFR that used to go out before 2001, was that people couldn't really assess how well governments were taking care of its infrastructure, particularly streets. Where could one know whether they're doing a good job of putting money into maintaining streets or not? And so that's why in the government-wide statements you now are reporting all the capital assets of the governmental activities, so sidewalks and the like. And over time, you should be able to get a sense of whether or not the city is reinvesting in those assets. So if you see that number diminishing over time, you know that it's depreciating but not being replaced with new. And that's one of the ways that, at least ostensibly, that the reader can now assess whether or not we're doing a good job of keeping up with our capital. In another area, there's a footnote disclosure. I'm not sure what page it's on, but it has to do with our streets. There's a pretty lengthy discussion about the condition of our streets. And in fact, it provides an index. It's called the PCI, or Pavement Condition Index, that is measured every year. And that's a way for the reader to assess whether specifically with streets, are we doing a good job or not. And I was talking to Mr. White recently at the Finance Committee meeting.
That's on page 85.
That number has been diminishing over time. At one point, when we first started doing this in 2001, it was in the 70s, and I believe now it's in the low 60s. Our goal is to not let that fall below 60, that rating index. But as you've heard from other presentations from Mr. Wozniak and Mr. Kelly, we have a shortage of funds to maintain all of our streets to the level we would like to. And so that condition rating has been dropping. And it will continue to drop until we find new resources to do a better job of maintaining our streets. But that's another area where it's just recently been added, where readers can assess how well we're doing with our infrastructure.
Yeah, because we don't have the opportunity, like, say, somebody could just walk away from a deteriorated house or something. We're going to be responsible for this forever. And so as it depreciates on one side, we've got to be able to accommodate for that on the other side to replace. Now, this is kind of a crazy question, but I get it from people all the time, so I'll just ask it out loud here. I mean, in the process, and auditor being right here, did we find like anything like hidden extra money in some drawers somewhere, or socks or anything like that? I mean, was there anything surprising that came up that we went, oh, whoa, we didn't know we had all that extra money hiding over there? I mean, any surprises?
Unfortunately, no. Mr. Kikuchi can jump in if he wanted to, but no. And the intent of the audit process is not to find money, of course, because they have full access to all of our general ledger and all our funds and accounts, so that if they found something that we didn't know about, that would be that'd be a shock. I mean, I'd quit.
Yes.
If that happened.
Yeah,
embarrassed.
I feel the energy behind those words, but it really does mean that our controls are solid, and that's what that statement at the very beginning is. You're really, having looked at it, I'm looking out the auditor here, looked at it thoroughly from a third-person, disassociated from anything perspective, and said, you guys keep really solid controls here. There's nothing like, no rough edges, really, to speak of.
Yeah, and there's some, and I will say that, it's all about materiality. They always, when you look at their opinion letter, it refers to the term materially, represents the financial condition and results. So there's no material error, and so there's no way that they can prove that every dollar is correct. There potentially could be some level of inaccuracy there, but it's within a materiality range that they determine to be acceptable. So their job isn't to tie out every dollar, but to make sure that materially it's correct. But they really do a good job of assessing our internal controls, because our records, in a sense, our accounting records in that document is only as good as our internal control procedures, because otherwise things don't wind up in the right place if we didn't have good internal controls. So they spend a lot of time assessing that part of it.
Now, we don't use the same auditor every single year, right? We've changed over time.
We usually change about every 5 years.
Every 5 years or so? Okay, so we keep that fresh and objective. Thank you very much, and thanks also to the auditor for the great work.
The issue about the streets on page 85 also made me think about the capital improvement plan, the 5-year plan, where we have hundreds of millions of dollars of a wish list of projects, but without funding. Is that in here somewhere in terms of deferred maintenance, or, I mean, because you're showing that in terms of streets and the level of the streets, but there are facilities that need upgrading, and how is that accounted for if it is in here?
Madam Mayor, this is kind of what I was talking about with Mr. House, that it's hard, you don't see that discreetly. Over time, if you were to sort of pay attention and look at the balance sheet of the government-wide statements, you would see that capital asset either going up, down, or staying about the same. Ideally, it should not go down. If it goes down, that means that, because you're depreciating that number every year, if you're not replacing it with an equal amount, or roughly an equal amount of new improvements or new assets, that means you're not keeping up with the least depreciation of those assets. So ideally, you would see that number over time staying flat or growing or getting bigger. And that's how you sort of measure that. But no, it doesn't provide any kind of planning doc. It's not a planning document about what we're planning to do in the future. It's sort of how have we been doing over time. And you have to look at prior years and look at the trends to be able to make that assessment.
So to look at the full financial health of the city, I mean, this is the snapshot of a particular fiscal year. It showed that the day-to-day work was very well managed. We actually put in close to $1 million back into reserves in the general fund. Right. So that showed good discipline on regular operating activities, but at long term, we still have an issue with long-term maintenance or capital needs or so forth. So we're paying the rent, but the roof might need replacing, and we have to find the money to, find new sources of revenue to make that happen.
And you're exactly right. It's a snapshot. You have to kind of look over a 5 or 10 year trend to see how well we're doing in those bigger issues.
Okay, that helps. We do need a motion for this. I don't see any public comment speaker slips.
So moved, Madam Mayor.
Second that.
This is the staff recommendation. Any other comments? All in favor?
Aye.
Great. Thank you for your work. A lot of work goes into this, I know. Okay, item number 13.
Authorize the city administrator to sign a term sheet with Mustang Renewable Power Ventures, LLC.
Okay, we'll move it to Mr. Four.
Good afternoon, Madam Mayor, council members. I'll say this, it's with great pleasure that we introduce this topic to you today. It's something that we've talked about numerous times. We've been to your council several times to talk about different aspects of the resource recovery project, and we're reaching kind of a big key milestone here today. So the things we'd like to talk about today, we'll give a little bit of background on the project that you've probably heard much of before. We'll then go into some specifics about the term sheet, and then talk a little bit about one specific piece of the term sheet, which is the exclusive right to negotiate that would be between the public agencies and the vendor, Mustang Renewable Power Ventures. And then we'll end with what you can expect from us in the coming months. So one of the things I wanted to start with is, this is a long project. And there are a lot of steps. And one of the things I wanted to start with is where exactly are we in the overall continuum of this project? There are probably 12 steps that are outlined here. And this is predicated on the assumption or the course of action where the City Council ultimately votes to join in a formal contract with the vendor. So just keep in mind that as you see this overall timeline and set of milestones, there are a lot of discretionary decision points for council, but this would be the overall timeline. So if we look at where we've come from, the first is to solicit proposals for the project, and as you're well aware, we've done that. We then selected the preferred project and the preferred vendor. The preferred project is the material recovery facility and the anaerobic digestion facility at Tehiguis landfill. And the preferred vendor, as I said before, is Mustang Renewable Power Ventures. And the third is to complete the technical and financial due diligence. That's something that the city staff as well as the other participating agency staff took on in earnest this spring and into the summer. And we completed that. We then have initiated the environmental review process, and we're beginning the drafting of the environmental impact report. That's what we discussed with you in November. And then where we are today is to present the term sheet to council. So we will have completed that by the end of this presentation. So the remaining milestones, where do we go from here? So in November, we had relayed to you that Marburg, one of the private companies in town, had expressed its desire to have its private properties considered as part of the environmental review process and also to be considered as the operator of the material recovery facility. So one of the next steps is to receive Marburg's proposal and then conduct the same level of technical and financial due diligence on that proposal as what we have previously performed on the Mustang proposal. We'll then complete the environmental review process, and we're assuming that that will take between 18 and 21 months to complete, so somewhere, say, in summer or fall of 2014, we hope to be done with that. In the intervening months, then, the staff from the participating agencies would be developing the framework and the key terms of a joint powers authority or agreement that would sort out how the public agencies will interact with one another in the management of this project. And then as one of the final steps, we would then negotiate the final business terms that are outlined in the term sheet that's before you today. The term sheet outlines a number of key variables that we would then negotiate as part of a final contract. If the council chose to, then we would execute the contract with the vendor, construct the facility, which would take a couple of years, and then we would begin processing waste. So that's the long continuum of this project, and we are here to look at the term sheet. So just a little bit of background. I won't spend too much time on this because you've heard this a number of times, but the project as proposed and the project as described in both the term sheet as well as in the environmental review documents that we are drafting consists of three different components. One is the material recovery facility, and that takes the trash, all the material that's currently in our trash cans, sorts it into three different components. One is the recyclables that we then send to market, as you'll see here on this graph. It then separates out the organic fraction, the organic material like food and other plant materials and things that are then digested in the anaerobic digester and that digestate is made into various grades of soil amendment. And then the residual, that's that which is left, which we really have no beneficial use for, it is ultimately buried at Tahiguas. One of the things I wanted to clarify that was requested the last time we were here is to again repeat that the project is proposed, all of this occurs at Tahiguas landfill. The material recovery facility and the anaerobic digester are all located at Tahiguas. So we'll get into the term sheet now. Some of the key elements of the term sheet. The first is that this term sheet is a non-binding agreement between the vendor, between Mustang Renewable Power Ventures and the public participants or the participating agencies. And what it really does, the purpose of it is it's going to outline the timeline and the framework for negotiating the future definitive agreements or the final contract that would be between the vendor and the public agencies. It will set forth the key business terms to be negotiated after the environmental review process. And as you'll recall, what we brought to you in November, we intentionally backed away from committing ourselves to any variables ahead of time, such as interest rates and debt to equity ratios and things like that. So all of those variables are described in the term sheet, and those will be the subject of future negotiations between the public agencies and the vendor. The term sheet would take effect upon the signature by the cities of Santa Barbara and Goleta, as well as the county of Santa Barbara. So there are 5 agencies that are involved, the 3 that are listed here, as well as the city of Solvang and Buellton, but 3 are required to actually make the term sheet to deem it in effect. And that's largely because these 3 agencies here are the largest producers of waste, and the cumulative waste here would make the project viable. It's notable that the City of Goleta and the County Board of Supervisors have already authorized their staff to sign the term sheet that's before you today. And we talked about the key business parameters. You've seen this slide before. This is just a list of those variables and the key business terms that we will sit down and negotiate with Mustang at a future date. The only other one that I would add to this are the locations of the components of the project. So as you'll recall in November, and as I previously said, with the entry of Marburg into the process, there are now some private properties that are being considered in the environmental review process, and those would be one of the variables that we would finalize as we get toward a final contract.
Mr. Farr,
sure.
Go back to that last slide if you could, where it says technologies to be used. We're looking at a couple of years here where we're going to be in negotiation of figuring this all out, and there could be new technologies. Is there room for introducing those or using those? Do we have some flexibility here?
Madam Mayor, Councilmember Hotchkiss, the technologies that Mustang has proposed technologies to be used, but again, that's one of those variables that's non-binding. We're not locking ourselves into using those exact variables. So sure, we could change those. It could impact the tipping fees and things that we're looking at,
right.
But that is one of the variables that's open.
Okay, thank you.
Are there any other questions before I go on to the term sheet? Okay. Or I'm sorry, the exclusive right to negotiate. So the exclusive right to negotiate, this is one of the pieces of the overall term sheet. It's almost like a subsection of that, and I just wanted to spend a little bit of time on that. The first is that it applies this exclusive right to negotiate that's granted to Mustang Renewable Power Ventures, gives them the exclusive right to negotiate with the participating jurisdictions on county-owned properties. And so we talked about Tahiguas landfill being the primary project location. So for any county-owned property, we negotiate with Mustang, and that's very clear in the term sheet. The exclusive right is binding on the public agencies. This is the one, as I said before, whereas the key business variables are non-binding and we're open to negotiation, this one piece of the exclusive right is binding on the jurisdictions. Nothing says that the city has to approve this project. We are not bound by that. But who we negotiate with on county properties, we are bound. And so that's kind of a critical distinction. This exclusive right to negotiate, however, does have sunset provisions, and there are really two of them. The first is that we are committing to negotiate with Mustang for 12 months following certification of the EIR by the County Board of Supervisors. So, for example, if in 18 months or so the County Board of Supervisors does certify the EIR, this exclusive right to negotiate would then continue for an additional 12 months, where we would really have 12 months and we would be working with Mustang to negotiate these terms and turn those into the definitive agreements that would be the ultimate contract. If the certification of the EIR notwithstanding, if 48 months elapse between the time that the term sheet is executed, then we would no longer be bound. So in any case, 48 months following execution of the term sheet, we commit to negotiate with Mustang. There is a provision that if there is third-party litigation related to the CEQA process, then that 48 months would be tolled for an additional 18 months. Any questions on the exclusive right? Okay.
Mr. Ford, every time we bring this up, I have the same reaction, so I'm just going to say it out loud. How do you negotiate with somebody when there's no opportunity for an alternative to that somebody? So it's just, again, layperson's perspective, but and given that an entire process could be held up for 4 years, if we found early on that we had a mismatch or there was something that we just couldn't be resolved, we would be stuck with this, excuse me, so sorry, but we'd be in a spot. For 4 years. Why would we give that up at this point? Why should we even today say that? And why don't we just not do that and do the rest of everything and then negotiate with them where there's a real honest, something to lose for the person that we're negotiating with?
I see Mr. Wiley coming to the mic here.
Madam Mayor, Councilmember House. Well, it's a good question, but in a way we're past,
I'm glad you said that first
that
part.
point. I think if we would ask the county staff, they would say they went through a very detailed, long process of requests for qualifications and then, more importantly, requests for proposals, where firms were allowed to submit, and there was essentially a selection process to get to what they have sometimes called the preferred vendor. And Mustang's at that point now, so that competition was there. It doesn't quite get to your point about, don't you always want competition when you're negotiating a big, important contract with someone? And we do, but the nature of a public-private project like this, something this big, there's a tremendous investment, both for the public entities, but also for the private entity. And it's really not an unfair thing or inappropriate thing for them to say, I'm going to be spending a lot of time and money negotiating with you, trying to work out this deal. I would like to know that you can't talk to anyone else while we're doing that. And that's what this ERTN, or exclusive right to negotiate, does provide for. And 48 months is because of the nature of this project, and I would say it easily could take 24 months to do the environmental review, that's probably an appropriate time period. Again, but it's still a good question. One of the reasons the city staff felt strongly about limiting this ERTN to county locations was the very concern you've expressed. So should the city at any point, and we don't foresee this happening, but even 6 months from now, the city says, we'd like to talk to somebody about another location not owned by the county of Santa Barbara, we can do that. And we, for the same concerns you've expressed, we pretty much asked for that to be in this term sheet. So
that's important for me to know. And also, I was going to ask you about the 48 months part, and it seems like you're answering it. The process for the environmental side of this whole equation could take as much as 2 years. There's the practical and operational pieces that have to be worked out.
Right. I think some of the public staff going into this thought 48 months sounded a little long, but it's a trade-off. It's the developer, the vendor had valid concerns for asking for 48 months. I think we all recognize the environmental review for something like this is probably going to take 18 months to 24 months. So 48 months, seemed appropriate.
Now, this process is not proscribed by someone. This is one that has been, the process has been negotiated to get us to these approvals at the different jurisdictions. Is that accurate?
That's correct. This is all worked out among ourselves. There's no state statutes that dictate any of this or anything like that. I should add that the likely scenario is not 48 months. It's actually the certification of the EIR. Let's say we're fortunate and the EIR is certified 18 months from now. Upon that certification, that'll trigger a 12-month period of exclusive negotiations.
Oh, I see. Okay.
Unless there's litigation, and then that could get extended 18 months. But the likely scenario is the certification of the EIR and a 12-month period of exclusive negotiation.
So the 48-month after the term sheet is executed, once the EIR is certified, then that's kind of gone, and now we're working with a 12-month period after that.
Yeah. We use the 48 months as an absolute kind of drop-dead expiration, just in case there was some real problem in getting through environmental review. And it sort of unraveled. It's the default number of when this ERTN would end.
And I thank you. I just asked, Madam Mayor, I asked this question with real respect of all those who have participated in this so far. I just, from the public's perspective, I think we need to have these questions out in the open and make sure we get these answers. Thank you.
So just to clarify a little more, it's 48 months, assuming everything moves forward here today, would start pretty much now. And it actually be less than 48 months if and when the EIR is certified and there's no litigation. If that happens in 18 months, then 18 and 12 would be 30. Mm-hmm. So that would be the outside. But if the EIR, if for some reason it's just not certified or it just gets dragged out and 48 months goes by and the EIR isn't even certified yet, the exclusive right to negotiate stops at 48 months, even though we're still, right. Okay.
Correct.
So that's sort of the outside term. Okay. Thank you.
So the exclusive right to negotiate, as we said, it applies to county-owned properties, but the term sheet also addresses how we handle private properties that enter the project scope. And so, so under the environmental review process, private properties will be evaluated as part of that overall project, most notably the Marburg properties where the current C&D facility sits. And in that case, if a private property is selected, any private property or any non-county owned property, then the participating agencies will have 12 months following the certification of the EIR to negotiate with the owner of that private property for a controlling use of that property to site whatever component of the project would be there. So, for example, let's take the Marburg property. They want the MRF to be located. They've asked for the MRF to be considered to be located there. If that were the case, then 12 months, if the EIR process and if the board selected the Marburg property as that location, then 12 months following the certification of the EIR, the public participants could then negotiate directly with Marburg for 12 months to gain control of that property. If, however, the anaerobic digester were selected to continue to be sited at Tahiguis, then the exclusive right to negotiate with Mustang would continue to remain in force between the public agencies and Mustang. So that's how that's all going to, for 12 months. So, good point. For 12 months following the certification of the EIR. So graphically, what does that look like? You know, this is a case where here's the MRF at an urban location, could be Marburg's property. And then the remainder, the anaerobic digester, would be sited at Tahiguis. The public participants in this case would be negotiating directly for 12 months following the certification of the EIR with the owner of that MRF location. And then pursuant to the exclusive right to negotiate that's contained in the term sheet with Mustang, we would be negotiating with Mustang for the same 12-month period to negotiate contracts for the anaerobic digester at Tahiguis. So where do we go from here? In the near term, our focus is really the environmental review process. So in November, the Board of Supervisors granted authorization to county staff to commence that process. They're doing that. And we think that that will take about 18 months to really get started, maybe 21 months from November, 18 months when we really start work on the draft. So these are estimated times, but you may expect to see a draft EIR to come out in fall of 2013. And then in summer of 2014, we're estimating that we would be back here for the City Council to make findings on that final EIR. As an intermediate step, especially with the analysis of private properties within the City of Santa Barbara, we would be bringing the draft EIR to the Planning Commission for review, and we're working with city planning staff quite closely on that aspect of the project. So with that, we'd be glad to take any questions.
Okay. I don't see any speaker slips. I want to acknowledge the county staff that's here, and Mustang and Marburg, everyone's, but not to have any speaker slips actually is pretty tremendous given the scope of this kind of project moving forward. So a lot of work I know went into this. Mr. Rouse.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. Mr. Fort, given that few slides back on the graphic of the system, how it works from the MSW into the system itself, given our current source separation, recycling, diversion of food scraps, that type of thing, what does that percentage of diversion end up being given today's absolute circumstance? I mean, what we have statistically today, just assuming that it's going to remain an AD.
On a project level?
Yeah.
On a project level, according to Mustang's RFP, they were estimating, based upon the waste characterization that they used at the time that they prepared their proposal, they were anticipating an overall diversion rate of about 62%. And that was about 37% diversion through the MRF. That was pulling off the recyclable material. That's the amount of recyclable material that's currently in the trash can. And getting about another 25% diversion through the anaerobic digester, and disposing of about 38%. So,
okay. And then, so given the remaining airspace at Tehigas, and given that we're going to be easily 3 or 4 years away from developing this or starting it up, what does that make our horizon, given those same circumstances?
Well, if you think about it, if we achieved a 50% diversion rate, that would double the remaining life. So if we had 10 years, we would be looking at 20. If we achieve a 62%, it'd be slightly higher than that, slightly longer. One of the things that we're looking at and we're encouraged by is that the City of San Jose, which is constructing a similar project, is a little bit further along than we are. And we're watching them closely to see what kind of diversion rates they are going to achieve, because it's possible that we could even get higher diversion than the 62%. So as one final piece of our due diligence, we'll be looking at that. One of the other pieces we're looking at is conducting another waste assessment of our waste to see how it's changed and how that diversion rate might be impacted. So, so the shorter answer is the vendor felt comfortable with a 62% diversion rate. Could be higher, could be lower, but we'll see as we learn more about the other projects like this that are coming online in California.
Which puts us well within the state mandates as we see them today.
Yes.
Okay, then, and San Jose is an AD facility as well?
It is.
Okay, thank you.
Ms. Murillo?
Thank you, Madam Mayor. So, Mr. Ford, thank you for your presentation. So aerobic digestion is still a possibility depending on the results of the CEQA review, the environmental review?
Madam Mayor, Councilman Murillo, yes, it's one of the options that is being looked at in the environmental review process. The vendor or the owner of the city's current organics processing operation, Ingle and Gray, has been giving a lot of information to the county's environmental review consultant to look at that site as a potential viable option. What we've decided to do is to look at that site from two key aspects first, that being air quality and emissions, as well as traffic. And if it shows, based on those two studies, that it is a potential candidate to be looked at a deeper level, such that the elected officials or that the board could select it at the time that they certify the EIR, we'll do that. So the jury is still a little bit out as we get to know that site a little bit more. But if it looks like a viable candidate, then we would certainly do the remaining studies that would allow the board to select it. And we'll know more as we go through the environmental review process.
Okay, and then finally, when we were talking about Marburg's trash hauling contract, I brought up this project as, asking staff to look at the intersection there or conflict of interest, or what does that mean to the city? And so I would flip it around now that we're talking about this project and make sure that we know that contract and this issue are, that the city's coming out with the best deal on both ends, if that makes sense. Thank you.
Mr. House?
I was just noticing that that after the lease term, there's an $1 buyout option at the end of that, but there's also an option for the operator to make a 10-year extension with another. I guess that would be every 10 years. I guess with a year notice, they could continue on and on. Is that a perpetual kind of arrangement, or how's that set?
Yeah, I don't know. Mark?
I'm on page 11, and I mean on 12 is the $1 buyout option, which is identified there, and it's the JPA has the option of acquiring the site for $1 at the end of the term of the lease. But then I looked at the term of the lease, which looks like to be on page 11, 20 years, and then there's a with a chance for a 10-year extension. It says at least one 10-year extension with a 1-year notice to the contractor of the intent to extend. And I just wondered how that works. Maybe the whole thing just does end in 20 years, but it looks like there's a likelihood of this being able to continue in 10-year increments from onward.
Madam Mayor, Councilmember House, Mark Schleich with the County of Santa Barbara. The $1 buyout option was to give the jurisdictions at the end of the term leverage if we were to renegotiate an extension of the contract. That was a recommendation by the consultant that helped us prepare the RFP, and that was based on his experience on projects of this nature on the East Coast. And when they came to the end, where the jurisdictions in essence bought or paid for it via their ratepayers' contribution to the project, they thought they should get a better tip fee or a favorable tip fee when they got to the end of the term of the project. All the capital had been paid for. Why are we paying for capital again? What they found is they didn't have much of a negotiating leverage because there was no option for them to buy it out. So that's why we added the provision for the $1 buyout. And again, whether we choose to extend it another 10 years is, again, something we would negotiate at the end of the 20 years. So it's kind of prescriptive as giving us kind of the option going forward, but by no means is it we shall or need to do that.
Well, and you were here, I think, for a little bit of our previous conversation. Maybe not, but just the it begs another question for me, and that is a certain life to this kind of a facility. I mean, like it's going to depreciate and it's going to fall apart here or there, rust over there. I mean, it's going to be kept up well, I'm sure, but the replacement of the operating equipment of this facility, I'm wondering how that's being built in. Almost like we've got it built into. We're coming up to our own little cliff in 20 years, and then we'll have to find money to replace or to repair or whatever. Is that kind of maintenance of effort after the 20 years or going into the future built into this equation?
Madam Mayor, Councilmember House, absolutely. The equipment has a replacement schedule built into it. There's a set-aside fund for capital replacement of equipment. This equipment has version 1, version 2, version 3 upgrades. So I'm assuming that as they improve the equipment, we'll be buying the improved equipment to be replaced on the other. The idea is at the end of 20 years, we'll have a fully operational, brand new or ready, fairly new recovery system. And if we need to replace some of that capital because it is not, we'll have a reserve fund that will roll into the jurisdictions if they choose to exercise the $1 option.
Thanks, Mr. Schleich. It's really reassuring. One more question. I don't know for whom it is, and that has to do with when is the decision made about the location of the MRF, the actual siting of the facility. I'm sure there's some discussion as to whether all those truck trips of the gross amount out to Tahigas versus, doing the sorting and separating nearer the source and then just taking fewer or smaller truck trips out there. I mean, that must be some big discussion about that at this point, right?
Madam Mayor, Councilman House, another outstanding question. The EIR is structured and budgeted such that we can do detailed review of the urban site, that being the Marburg facility as well as the Tahigas site. And one of the largest contracts we have with the consultant is actually air quality. Obviously, traffic will be studied as well. So the issue of what those numbers are will come out of the EIR. Common sense would say shorter distance would be a better result. How that affects, I don't know, but that's, that approach is being followed through with an air quality expert, with greenhouse gas quantification being included.
So in effect, if I understand you, the environmental impact report is actually being used as part of the decision-making process as which site or which location we would be using. Often that's done ahead of time. You get a preferred alternative. You study the preferred alternative. But
the preferred alternative is the Tahigas landfill location for the entire project. There was a lot of discussion and a lot of interest as to alternative sites in the urban area. Mm-hmm. The Marburg facility is the example that we're using. And so we're looking at doing studies at a significant level that if the EIR, the environmental impact report by which decision makers make their decision, comes back and the decision is, why are we trucking it up there? It's best for the community to have it in an urban location. We'll have done all that homework ahead of time so we don't have to go back and restudy that, do that effort again, which would take another 12 to 18 months to complete and recirculate and go through that public process. So the idea is to get to the information part, the environmental impact report, so there are options for the decision makers so they can make the best decision for the community.
All right, great, thank you. Those are my questions, Madam Mayor. And again, that's really important. I think that we have that we do that work up front instead of waiting to be challenged and then have to go through the whole process and take extra time to find out. So thank you very much for sharing that. That's where we're going to be doing it.
Just while you're up there, Mr. Schleich, part of the other issue of extending leases and so forth is the capacity at Tahigas. Anyway, I mean, they're two different things. Is where do you put the residual waste? And the whole point of this is to extend the life at Tahigas, but then there's the equipment used to reduce the amount of waste that needs to go somewhere. So it's possible, let's say this is some Energizer bunny of a facility at Tahigas, but that could go on, but we might still lose the capacity of the Tahigas landfill to actually transport the final waste right there. I mean, who knows what that's going to look like, but at least for 20 years we know where the residual waste is going to go. Whether it's 30 or 40 or whatever, that's a whole big question that we don't know the answer to, depending on how well this works in terms of the rate of waste disposal. Excuse me. Right?
Right. This project actually, from an environmental impact review, is called a subsequent EIR, meaning it's subsequent to the project that's previously approved or the environmental impact report that's done there. And that was to provide long-term waste disposal to the community. So what we're, in essence, doing is processing the waste at a higher level so that the long-term disposal lasts longer. We put in a significant investment in liner systems at the landfill, excavating the site so we could put the 6 foot of liner material or composite liners in place. It's $25 million, $28 million of capital improvement. It just seems wise if we can make that investment last longer. It's a wise investment, and it gives us local control over the long term.
Great. Thank you. Any other questions or comments, or is there a motion?
Madam Mayor?
Yes, Mr. Francisco.
I move that we authorize the city administrator to sign this agreement between us, the county, and the city of Goleta in a form acceptable to the city attorney, of course.
Of course. Is there a second?
Second.
Okay, any other comments? All in favor?
Aye.
Aye. Okay, congratulations. It's a big step forward. Okay, council member committee assignment reports. Mr. White.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. I attended the Fire and Police Commission meeting on the 13th of December, and both departments, both fire and police departments, reported on academies and new hires. I thought there was one interesting piece, which is the fire staff reported that there were 6 openings, and that all the folks that they're looking to hire are laterals. So they're people that have been firefighters already, and whereas the police staff also reported cadets at the academy, and that the preference there is for new folks that have not been in a department previously, but are being trained basically from the start. So I believe the numbers are, there are 6 openings in the fire department, and then there are 8 cadets in the police department at this point, and of course, it looks like 3 to 5 more will be needed in the academy in the spring. Also, they reported that the La Pachanga, the legendary entertainment establishment on, I believe it's on Milpa Street, was raided and cited for having B-girls, and received a 45-day suspension, is what I learned from that particular meeting. Secondly, did not attend the Water Commission meeting on the 10th, but there were there was some year information for the year, which I think is interesting. And let's see if I can get to that. Here it is. The water, water year is not a calendar year, and the water year is not a fiscal year. The water year is a water year and goes to the September 30th of each year. And as of September 30th, Lake Cachuma ended with a 77%, being 77% full. So there's no immediate concern about local water shortage, but of course our supply is managed with the idea that any year may be the first year of a drought. The groundwater resources are in balance. And finally, the demand for the year was just over 14,000 acre feet, which is slightly above our target, but that reflects a year in which there was 40% less rainfall than average. So we went slightly over our normal usage, but we did it in the context of a reasonably dry year.
Mr. Rouse?
Thank you, Madam Mayor. This month's regular meeting, the Downtown Parking Committee met at the Railroad Depot property to assess the eventual inclusion of all those properties into gated and paid parking as part of the system that we have today, and also the potential use of the old open-air bicycle building, which is currently standing vacant except for the portion that's run by Greyhound. And then I also attended the Don's Net Cafe Awards at the Cabrillo Rec Center the other day, and that was a tremendous showing of some activities that kids have as alternatives to not so good activities. So a great showing, very, very well attended, just completely packed the place. So very gratifying to see.
Ms. Murillo?
Thank you, Madam Mayor. The mayor and I were at the Habitat for Humanity housing ribbon cutting, and I mean, it was so gratifying. Groundbreaking?
Right. Ribbon cutting's when it's built.
And the little kids were shoveling the dirt, and the families are so looking forward to their new homes. And, you know, here it is, Santa Barbara, where people hang on by their fingernails to their housing. So it was a wonderful event. I attended the Casa Esperanza holiday dinner, and a thank you to Lady Ridley Tree, who provided prime rib, and very nice. There was entertainment, and the homeless shelter is at full capacity, and not, you know, always a happy place, but that night, very, very nice event. And then we were in the Milpas Holiday Parade. I know all 7 of us were there. Not a meeting, but I wanted to give a shout out to the Dawn Riders, and again, the mayor and I were together in a Surrey, And and I'd like to give a shout out to the elite cheerleaders and to the Santa Barbara Youth Council. Thank you.
Mr. Francisco?
Thank you, Madam Mayor. The Kachuma Operations and Maintenance Board met this week, and I just wanted to point out three interesting achievements. The first is the completion of the modified upper reach replacement program. And so 2,000 feet of 48-inch pipe in a very inconvenient area, very steep slopes, that has been completed. A new bridge on Kyoto Creek, which will allow fish passage, was also completed. And the neighbors up there are happy with it, so we're happy about that. And finally, tomorrow is going to be a Tecolote Tunnel inspection walk, the first in several years. And engineers from COMB as well as the Bureau of Reclamation will walk the entire 6.5-mile length of the Tecolote Tunnel, the tunnel that conveys water from Kachuma to what's called the South Portal above Glen Annie, looking for any problems, corrosion, cracks, shifts, and hopefully everything will be fine. And I wish the gentlemen who are walking through the tunnel luck.
And hopefully they're not claustrophobic.
Well, claustrophobia is one issue. Hydrogen sulfide gas is the main issue. And in fact, we have rescue teams standing by on both sides of the tunnel in case anything goes wrong.
Ooh. Good job there. Mr. House.
Imagine waiting when you're in the middle of the tunnel for someone to walk 3 miles to get to you to save you. Oh, man.
Just keep walking.
Okay, just keep walking. Yeah. Let's see. So the other day was the last meeting of the South Coast Homeless Advisory Committee. And the meeting began with us declaring that that would be our last meeting. So it's just real clear where that line of demarcation stands. I had the privilege of chairing that for some time with Kathleen Reddington from Carpinteria and Janet Wolf and Doreen Farr from the county. And it was very productive during the time that it convened. So what we've done, I mentioned this last time, but we've actually written up a kind of a white paper. It's a whole series of major issue areas regarding homelessness and uses maybe some new language, speaks about people who are experiencing homelessness as opposed to the homeless. But it actually identifies areas that we really are hopeful that the C3H collaborative takes into consideration, and even the approach that we used, which engaged practitioners, service providers, and whom are also called consumers, people who use the services, in the dialogue. And we're really strongly encouraging that that will continue. Supervisor Farr will be delivering that report to making sure that that's conveyed to the C3H Policy Council when that convenes in January. And then just prospectively, I'll be representing us taking your seat at Santa Barbara County Association of Governments and APCD Air Pollution Control District this Thursday. Lastly, I just want to say I've been going, as some of us have, all of us have, to different parties and gatherings, around town with the holidays. And just to see all these little children, decked out, the Las Posadas at Casa de la Raza and the, let's see, just the dancing children. I don't know, it just gets me going. So with all the stuff that's going on in the world, it's really reassuring and wonderful to be able to participate and enjoy our community at that level. Thank you very much, Madam Mayor.
Mr. Hotchkiss.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. Start off with the Poet Laureate Subcommittee, or whatever it is, I'm not sure what we call it, has gotten things rolling, and we're going to start taking applications for next year's, or actually 2 years, 2-year term for the new Poet Laureate. As you know, Madam Mayor, the League of Women Voters had a very interesting holiday party that was great because it got people from the various jurisdictions to talk about what they saw as upcoming problems. We were well represented by the mayor, but it was also good to hear from Carpinteria and Goleta. The Creeks Advisory Committee had a really fascinating study presentation that was like listening to CSI Miami or something, with the detective work they do to use to find what's coming from where and try to separate what's natural and what's not natural. God, it was just great stuff. So they promised to give me the telephone book version of that study. I maybe have asked for more than I want, but anyway. And let's see. Christmas party, we don't want to talk about that. Milpas Parade was terrific. And we got to ride, at least some of us, in very elegant cars, and kids were, it was great. And so, it's really fun. It's amazing you're in those cars, and you look at somebody and you say, Merry Christmas, and they realize that you're looking at you, and they come right back. I mean, there's a real contact. I used to think it was all just kind of blah, but I loved it. And my wife joined me, and that was kind of nifty. And finally, the mayor and I were yesterday at a Sansum Clinic unveiling of their new, what do I want to call it, better disposal system, where they're reducing by 80% their total amount of stuff that goes to a landfill, and coming up with some great usable product for gardens, et cetera. Maybe you want to talk a little bit about that. I think you know it better than I do. But and this was just one of their 20 facilities that was so successful, so they're looking to roll it out into their other 19.
Just to follow up, the issue is when you go to the doctor and have a doctor's visit and they have the table paper on and then you wear the smock, they're going to be able to compost that. And as far as our environmental services staff know, they can't find another clinic in California or really anywhere that does this. So this is very pioneering and obviously reduces the waste for a clinic like that, as you mentioned, by 80%. It's going to, I think they are reducing, they used to have 2 big pickups 5 times a week of trash, and that's now being reduced to 1 pickup 2 times a week. So just to show how much is going into the yellow bins and being composted. So
and I think they said it would save them $1,200 to $1,400 a month.
Right.
Which is great.
Right. In that one facility. Right. So they're testing it out at the Positas Lane main clinic, and so kudos to the staff there, and it takes a lot of training, but a lot of the training done by our own environmental services department in making that happen. So in the yellow bins and all of that. By going last, you mentioned many of the things that I was going to mention, which is great. So there's a lot going on in this town. It's really quite heartwarming to see how this community comes together in the holiday period. You have a last closed session to mention.
Conference with labor negotiator.
Okay. We won't have anything to report out, and this will be our last meeting of 2012. I want to wish everyone out there a safe and joyous holiday season, and enjoy your friends and family the next few weeks, as we all will, I'm sure, and we'll see you in 2013.